Lena stepped out of her small old car and looked at the glass building in front of her. The sun reflected off the polished cars lined up in front of the dealership, and she could already feel the stares from the salesman inside. Her dress was simple, just a soft cotton outfit she wore often to run errands, and her shoes were slightly worn from walking everywhere instead of driving. But today she was not here to buy groceries, she was here to find a car for herself. As she walked into the air-conditioned showroom, she noticed how spotless everything was. The smell of leather and new paint filled the air. The salesman behind the counter glanced at her and gave a quick fake smile before turning back to his phone. Lena quietly walked closer, trying to ask about a model she had seen online, but before she could speak, another salesman approached with an arrogant grin. "Can I help you?" he said, stretching the words as if they carried weight. "Yes, I want to know about that car over there," Lena said, pointing toward a silver sedan near the corner. The salesman crossed his arms and smirked. "That one," he said with a laugh. "I am not sure that model fits your budget, ma'am." Lena blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. He chuckled again, glancing at her shoes, then back to her old car visible through the glass door. "It is an expensive car," he said. "Maybe you should check out the used section down the street." A couple of other salesmen nearby snickered, trying to hide their laughter, as she looked down embarrassed. Lena nodded slowly and said, "I see, thank you for your time," and turned to leave. But as she stepped outside, one of the salesmen called after her, "Don't worry, maybe someday you'll be able to afford one." The men laughed loudly, while she quietly got back into her car and drove away. What they did not know was that Lena's husband David was one of the most private billionaires in the city. He had built his fortune from the ground up, starting with a single small garage, and now owned half the luxury car dealerships in the region. That evening, when Lena told him what had happened, she did not sound angry, just disappointed. David listened silently, his expression calm, but his eyes darkened with quiet fury. The next morning, the same dealership buzzed with energy as the staff prepared for an unannounced visit from their regional owner. They had no idea who was coming, only that a luxury Rolls-Royce Phantom would arrive soon for inspection. When the elegant black Rolls-Royce pulled up, the salesmen straightened their ties and adjusted their jackets, ready to impress whoever stepped out. The door opened slowly, and to their shock, Lena stepped out first. The same simple woman they had laughed at the day before. Behind her, David emerged, tall, calm, and impeccably dressed, his presence instantly commanding attention. The rude salesman froze in place, his face pale, as David's sharp gaze swept across the showroom. No one spoke as the silence grew heavy, only the ticking of the showroom clock echoed through the glass walls. David looked at Lena and said softly, "Show me the car you wanted to buy yesterday." Lena nodded and began to walk toward the silver sedan, while every salesman's heart pounded louder than their footsteps. Lena stopped beside the silver sedan and gently touched the door handle, her eyes calm but filled with quiet confidence. David stood beside her, his voice steady but firm as he spoke to the dealership manager, who had just rushed over, sweating nervously. "My wife was here yesterday," he said, "and your staff told her this car was not for her." The manager glanced toward the salesman who had insulted Lena, his face turning red and eyes darting in panic. "Sir, I am so sorry. There must have been some misunderstanding," he stammered. David looked at him expressionless and said, "I am sure there was no misunderstanding. I would like to see how your employees treat customers in real situations, not just when they smell money." The rude salesman swallowed hard, trying to smile as David stepped closer, inspecting the car slowly. Lena walked around the sedan, her fingers tracing the smooth surface as the sunlight reflected off the polished hood. "This one feels right," she said softly, her voice gentle, yet filled with quiet strength. David nodded. "If you like it, you should have it." The salesman finally spoke, his tone trembling. "Of course, sir, we can arrange everything immediately." David turned his gaze toward him and said, "I am not buying it from you. I am buying it from your replacement." The words struck like thunder through the silent showroom. The staff stood frozen, unable to breathe. Lena looked at David, unsure what to say, but he gently took her hand, reassuring her with a small nod. The manager began to plead nervously, "Please, sir, please give us another chance. This will never happen again." David's eyes softened slightly, but his tone remained steady. "Treat every customer with respect, no matter what they look like, because you never know who they truly are." The rude salesman lowered his head, ashamed, as David guided Lena toward a private office at the back of the showroom. Inside the office, the lights were softer and the atmosphere quieter. Lena sat down in the leather chair and looked out the glass wall at the cars outside. David leaned beside her desk and smiled for the first time since they arrived. "So, which color do you want, silver or black?" Lena smiled faintly. "I think silver suits me better." Outside the showroom, whispers spread among the employees as they watched the couple sitting together, everyone realizing too late who they had laughed at the day before. The manager ordered the paperwork to be prepared immediately, his hands trembling, while he kept glancing toward the office door. Lena glanced at David and said softly, "You did not have to do this for me." He looked at her with warmth and said, "You deserve respect from everyone always." Lena's eyes glistened as she looked down at her hands, remembering the laughter and humiliation from the previous day, but now there was no trace of pain, only quiet pride growing inside her. Lena sat quietly watching the sunlight glint off the cars outside as David signed a few papers on the desk beside her. The air felt still heavy with the tension that hung between the staff and the truth they had just witnessed. Through the glass wall, the rude salesman stood frozen near the door, his face pale, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, afraid to move or speak. David finished the last signature, then looked up at Lena with a small smile. "I want you to take this one home today," he said calmly. Lena looked surprised. "Home today?" she repeated softly. "Yes," David replied. "You waited long enough. I want to see you drive it out of here yourself." Her heart fluttered a little. She had never owned anything so grand, so perfect. She still felt like she did not belong among all this glass and steel and shine. But when she looked at David's calm eyes, she found courage. The manager entered quietly, holding a small set of keys, his hands shaking slightly. "Here are the keys, sir, ma'am," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. David nodded, his gaze sharp yet controlled. "You may hand them to my wife," he said firmly. The manager quickly stepped forward and placed the keys gently in Lena's hand, avoiding her eyes, but his tone now respectful. Lena stood holding the keys for a moment, then turned to look at the silver sedan parked just beyond the glass doors. It gleamed like a mirror under the bright morning light. David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder and said softly, "Go on, try it out." As she walked out of the office, the entire staff went silent again, the clicking of her heels on the polished floor echoing through the showroom. She paused beside the car, tracing her hand over the cool metal before opening the door, and, settling into the seat, the smell of new leather filling her senses, she started the engine, the soft hum powerful and smooth, making her heart skip a beat. From inside the showroom, David watched her with quiet pride while the salesman who had laughed at her stood near the window, his stomach tight with shame. Every face turned as Lena gently pressed the accelerator and the car began to move, the silver paint glimmering in the sunlight. She circled the driveway slowly, her hands steady on the wheel, her expression calm and graceful, like someone reclaiming something that was always hers. When she parked again, near the front door, David was waiting there, his eyes full of warmth. He opened her door and helped her out as if it was the most natural thing in the world while the staff watched silently. "You see," David said softly to her, "it suits you perfectly." Lena smiled shyly. "It does," she whispered, though her voice trembled slightly as she tried to hide how much this moment meant to her. From behind them, the salesman who had mocked her earlier stepped forward, his voice low and nervous. "Sir, I am deeply sorry for how I treated your wife yesterday. I did not know who she was." David turned slowly, his expression calm but cold. "You did not need to know who she was to treat her with respect," he said quietly. The salesman lowered his head, unable to meet his eyes, while Lena looked away, her heart heavy with mixed feelings of pity and justice. The other staff members stood quietly, some nodding slightly, as if realizing for the first time the weight of their behavior. David took Lena's hand again and said, "Come on, we have a place to be." They began walking toward the exit together, their steps slow and steady as the morning light streamed through the glass, and the silver car gleamed behind them like a silent witness to everything that had changed that day. As they stepped outside, the warm breeze brushed against Lena's face, carrying the faint scent of city air and sunlight on metal. She looked back one last time, through the wide glass windows of the dealership, and saw the staff standing still, watching them leave in silence. The rude salesman lowered his head again, guilt written across his face, while the manager whispered something hurriedly to him, but David did not look back, his calm stride said enough. Lena walked beside him, holding the car keys loosely in her hand, still half afraid this moment was a dream she would wake from soon. When they reached the Rolls-Royce parked beside the entrance, David opened the door for her and waited until she was seated before walking around to the other side. He sat down and looked at her with a soft smile. "You handled that well," he said quietly. "I am proud of you." Lena smiled faintly. "I was just trying not to cry," she said in a low voice, but her eyes shimmered with quiet strength. David reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "They do not deserve your tears," he said. "They deserve the lesson you gave them." She nodded, her gaze drifting toward the dealership shrinking in the distance as the car rolled down the smooth road. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The sound of the engine filled the silence like a calm heartbeat. Lena looked out the window and said softly, "Do people always judge like that just by how someone looks?" David's eyes stayed on the road. "People see what they want to see," he said. "Some measure worth by clothes and cars, but they forget that real strength does not always shine from the outside." Lena turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe that is why you never show off, even though you could have everything." David smiled a little and said, "Maybe, or maybe because I already have everything that matters sitting right beside me." Lena's cheeks flushed with warmth, and she looked away, pretending to study the passing trees outside the window. After a while, they drove past a small cafe near the park, the same one where they had met years ago, before the money, before the company, before the world started calling him a billionaire. David slowed the car and parked near the sidewalk. "Come on," he said softly. "I think we both need a little break." They walked into the cafe together, the same bell chiming above the door that had rung on the day they first met, the same smell of coffee and warm bread filling the air. The old man behind the counter smiled in recognition. "Miss Lena, it has been a long time," he said cheerfully, still calling her miss like he used to when she was just another regular customer. Lena smiled warmly at him. "It has been years," she said softly, "but it still feels the same." David ordered 2 coffees, and they sat by the window, sunlight falling gently across their table. For a few moments it felt like nothing had changed. No billions, no luxury cars, no heavy titles, just 2 people sharing quiet moments and remembering how it all began. Lena looked outside, watching the cars rush past on the road, and whispered to herself, "I never wanted to prove anything, I just wanted to be treated like a person." David heard her words, but did not speak. He simply placed his hand over hers, and she felt the calm strength that had carried them through everything. Somewhere in the distance, a soft thunder rolled as clouds began to gather, the sky shifting from bright blue to a muted gray, hinting at an afternoon rain waiting to fall. The first drops of rain tapped gently against the window, the sound soft and steady like a quiet rhythm that filled the air around them. Lena watched the raindrops slide down the glass, leaving silver trails that blurred the world outside into a painting of color and motion. David sat across from her, his coffee untouched, his gaze fixed on her face, as if reading every thought that passed behind her calm eyes. "You are quiet today," he said finally, his voice low and even. Lena smiled faintly. "I am just thinking," she said, "thinking how fast people change, how quickly they judge, and how easily they regret." David leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "People often forget what kindness costs," he said, "sometimes nothing, but it can change everything." Lena nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "I do not think I will ever forget how they laughed," she whispered, "not because it hurt, but because it showed me how people truly are when they think no one is watching." David looked at her with quiet admiration. "That is why I love you," he said. "You see things as they are, not as they pretend to be." She looked up surprised, her heart warming at his words, but she did not speak. Instead, she just smiled a little and looked down again, hiding the emotion behind her eyes. Outside, the rain grew heavier, the streets glistening under the soft gray sky, while the city seemed to slow down around them. People hurried past holding umbrellas, the cafe lights flickering warmly against the dimming afternoon. David's phone buzzed on the table, but he ignored it, letting it ring until it stopped, his attention still on Lena. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think success was about building things, about owning more, but now I realize it is about moments like this, sitting here with you, and knowing that nothing else matters." Lena looked up, her eyes reflecting the light from the window. "I do not need much," she said softly, "just peace and truth. That is enough for me." David smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes. "I know, and that is why you have more than most people ever will." They sat together in silence, again the world outside fading to the sound of rain against glass, the coffee growing cold, but neither of them caring. Then a car horn sounded outside, breaking the stillness. The same silver sedan parked at the dealership, now stopped by the curb, its sleek frame wet from the rain. David turned his head slightly and smiled. "Looks like your car is ready," he said gently. Lena blinked in surprise. "How did you?" she started, but David only chuckled. "I made a few calls while you were ordering coffee." He stood and held out his hand. "Come on, I think it is time for you to take your first real drive." Lena hesitated for a moment, then reached for his hand, rising slowly from her seat, her heart fluttering with quiet excitement and a little disbelief. They stepped outside under the cafe awning, the rain falling steady around them. David took off his jacket and held it over her head as they walked toward the shining car waiting by the curb. The valet handed her the keys with a polite smile and stepped back as David opened the driver's side door for her. "Go on," he said softly, "it is yours now." Lena took a deep breath and slid into the seat, the familiar smell of leather filling the air again, only this time it was hers. David leaned on the open window, watching her with pride and a hint of nostalgia in his eyes. "You remember when we used to dream about things like this?" he said quietly. Lena nodded, her fingers resting lightly on the steering wheel. "I do, but I never thought it would come true like this." David smiled. "Then maybe the best dreams are the ones we do not expect to come true." Lena looked ahead through the windshield, watching the rain pour down in soft waves across the street, the world outside blurred and silver, like a dream she could almost touch. She turned the key and the engine came to life, smooth and steady, the quiet hum echoing through her chest as if the car itself breathed with her. David stood beside the window, his hair damp from the rain, his expression calm but full of warmth as he watched her get comfortable behind the wheel. "You will do fine," he said gently, his voice steady over the sound of rain. Lena smiled softly, her hands gripping the wheel. "I have not driven anything new in years," she said, her tone half nervous, half excited. "Then it is time to start again," David replied with a reassuring look. She nodded slowly, then shifted into gear, the tires rolling forward through the wet street, the sound of water splashing under them like soft music. David followed her in the Rolls-Royce, keeping a short distance behind as they drove through the quiet afternoon city, the rain light reflecting on both cars as if connecting them in motion. Lena's heart raced, not from fear but from freedom. She felt something awaken inside her, a small but steady pulse of confidence that had been buried for years under hesitation and doubt. She passed the corner store where she used to stop for bread on her way home from work, the same store she once stood outside counting coins in her hand, hoping it would be enough. Now she was driving a car she once thought she could only admire through the glass of someone else's life. The rain began to slow, the gray clouds parting just enough for the sunlight to break through, casting golden streaks across the wet road. David's car pulled up beside her at a red light, his window lowered slightly, and he smiled at her through the rain. "Missed you are unnatural," he said. Lena laughed softly, shaking her head. "I am just trying not to stall," she said, but her voice carried a joy she had not felt in a long time. When the light turned green, they drove side by side until they reached the outskirts of the city where the roads widened and the air felt lighter. Lena parked near a quiet overlook, the view opening toward the hills still covered in mist from the rain. David stopped behind her and stepped out, walking over with his hands in his pockets, his expression soft as he looked at the view and then at her. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said. The rain made everything shine. Lena nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "It feels like a new beginning," she whispered. David looked at her for a long moment before speaking softly. "Maybe it is," he said. "Maybe this is where we start living for ourselves again." The wind brushed gently through her hair, carrying the clean scent of rain and earth, the sky slowly brightening with a pale light that made everything look almost new. Lena took a deep breath, her heart still steady from the drive, and for the first time in years, she felt completely unafraid. Lena stood beside the car for a moment, the soft wind brushing against her face, the scent of rain still lingering in the air. She looked out at the rolling hills in the distance, their green slopes glistening with drops of water catching the sunlight like tiny mirrors. David walked closer, standing beside her, without speaking, his quiet presence enough to fill the silence between them. For a while they both just stood there, listening to the faint hum of cars far away and the soft rustle of the breeze through the wet grass. Lena closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the world sink into her chest, the peace of it washing away the sting of what had happened at the dealership. She turned to look at David, his calm eyes steady on the horizon, as if he saw something beyond what anyone else could see. She said softly, I used to think people like you and me lived in different worlds, you with your success, and me with my small dreams. David turned his gaze toward her and smiled, that gentle smile that always made her heart still. For a moment, you built those dreams with me, he said quietly. Without you, none of this would matter. Lena felt her throat tighten. She looked away, quickly blinking at the light shimmering off the road below. She laughed softly to ease the emotion. I never imagined we would come this far, she said, remembering the small apartment where they once shared a single couch and counted every bill before the month ended. David's eyes softened. I did, he said, because I believed in you even when you didn't believe in yourself. Lena looked at him, then her voice barely above a whisper, you always say things that make me feel like I can do anything. That is because you can, he replied, his voice calm, but full of truth. A bird flew overhead, its wings slicing through the pale light before disappearing into the open sky. The moment, so quiet it felt like the world had paused just to let them breathe. David leaned against the car, watching her for a moment before speaking again. Tomorrow, I want you to come with me to the foundation office. I think it is time you took charge of something. Lena blinked, surprised me, she asked, unsure what he meant. David nodded. You have the heart for it, he said softly. The people there need someone who understands what struggle really means, someone who remembers what it feels like to be looked down on. Lena hesitated, her fingers brushing the smooth surface of the car door as she thought about his words. I do not know if I am ready, she said honestly. David looked at her with quiet certainty. You are ready, he said. You just have to see it the way I do. Lena turned back toward the hills, her heart filled with a mix of doubt and hope, the wind tugging gently at her hair, the sound of life moving again after the rain. Somewhere behind them, the clouds began to break fully, and the sunlight poured across the valley, painting everything in gold and green. Lena stood there, breathing it all in, feeling the world open before her like a story, still being written, one she was finally ready to be a part of. Lena turned to face David, her eyes reflecting the soft light that shimmered across the wet road below. The idea of leading something so important both thrilled and scared her. She had never thought of herself as a leader. She had always been the quiet one, the one in the background. David's calm gaze never wavered. He could see the doubt in her, but also the strength beneath it, the same strength that had carried them through every hard season of their lives. She sighed softly, the wind lifting her hair, as she said, I will think about it. David smiled slightly. That is all I ask, he said, because I know what your answer will be. Lena looked down at the car keys in her hand, the silver logo catching the sunlight. She remembered the laughter from the dealership and how small she had felt in that moment, but now the feeling had changed completely. It was no longer about revenge or pride, it was about knowing who she was and not letting anyone else decide her worth. They stood together for a while longer, neither speaking, the world around them slowly drying as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Eventually, David reached for her hand and said softly, come on, let us drive a little farther. There is something I want to show you. Lena nodded and followed him into the car, the engine humming to life again as they pulled away from the overlook and down the winding road. The landscape opened wide on both sides, fields stretching toward the horizon dotted with trees still wet from the rain, their leaves glistening like glass. Lena watched the scenery pass by, the road curving gently through the countryside. She felt calm now, the nervousness from earlier replaced with a quiet peace. David glanced at her from the driver's seat, noticing the faint smile on her face. You like it out here, don't you? He asked. She nodded. I always did, she said. It feels like the world slows down here, like I can breathe again. David's smile widened. I knew you would say that, he said. They drove for another few minutes until he turned onto a narrow gravel path lined with tall trees, their branches arching overhead to form a canopy of green. Lena looked around, curious. Where are we going? She asked softly. David's eyes twinkled with a hint of mystery. You will see, he said, just wait. The car rolled to a stop in front of an old farmhouse standing at the edge of a small lake, the water calm and silver under the afternoon light. Lena stepped out slowly, her shoes crunching on the gravel as she looked around. The quiet place felt untouched by time, the kind of peace she had only dreamed of. David walked beside her, his hands in his pockets, and said, this used to belong to my grandfather. I bought it back years ago, but never did anything with it. I thought maybe it was time for someone else to bring it back to life. Lena looked at him, puzzled. Someone else? David nodded. Someone who sees beauty in things that others overlook, someone like you. Lena's breath caught for a moment, her gaze moving from the lake to the worn wooden porch to the flowers growing wild by the fence. The place felt like it was waiting for her. "You want me to take care of it?" she asked softly. David smiled. "You could make it whatever you want," he said. "Maybe a home, maybe a retreat, maybe a place where people can come to start again, just like we did." Lena looked back at the lake, her reflection shimmering on the surface, and for the first time, she saw herself not as the woman who had been laughed at, but as someone strong enough to change the world around her. Lena walked slowly toward the edge of the lake, her steps soft against the damp grass, the air still carrying the scent of rain and earth. The surface of the water rippled gently with the breeze, each small wave catching the light and scattering it like tiny sparks. She crouched down near the water, touching it with her fingertips. It felt cool and alive, like something that had been waiting for her all along. David watched her from a short distance, his expression calm, but full of quiet admiration. She looked at peace here more than she had in years. "This place is beautiful," she said softly, her eyes still on the water. "It is," he replied, "and it is even more beautiful when someone loves it again." Lena turned to look at him, a question forming in her eyes. "Are you sure you want me to take care of it?" she asked. "I do not even know where to start." David smiled, that calm, steady smile that always made her feel safe. "You will figure it out," he said. "You always do." Lena stood up, brushing her hands against her dress. She looked around the property, the weathered barn, the tall trees swaying slightly in the wind, the porch with its peeling paint. Everything about it felt real and full of history. She could almost imagine children running through the grass, a garden blooming by the fence, the sound of laughter echoing across the lake. Her heart stirred with something she could not quite name, maybe hope, maybe belonging. David walked closer, standing beside her, the soft gravel crunching beneath his shoes. "You see it, don't you?" he asked. Lena nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I see what it could be." He looked at her with quiet pride. "That is what matters," he said. "Most people only see what is broken. You see what can be rebuilt." Lena smiled faintly, her eyes still on the old farmhouse. Maybe for the first time in her life, she felt like she was looking at a place that matched her soul, weathered, but full of light. She turned back to David and said, "What if we fixed it together?" David raised an eyebrow, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Are you sure you want to do the work yourself?" he asked teasingly. Lena laughed softly. I think I need to," she said. "There is something about building with your own hands. It feels honest." David nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "Then we will do it together," he said. The wind grew softer, now carrying the faint sound of birds hidden among the trees, the sun dipping lower in the sky and painting everything in a warm golden glow. Lena took one last look at the lake before turning back toward the house, her mind already full of plans. She wanted to paint the porch, plant flowers, fix the broken fence, and breathe life into every forgotten corner. David followed her quietly, his eyes never leaving her as she stepped onto the porch, the old wood creaking beneath her feet, but strong enough to hold her. She pushed open the door, and the faint scent of old cedar and dust filled the air. Light filtered through the windows, falling across the empty floor like gentle waves. Lena walked inside, her heart full, her mind already dreaming of what this place could become. Lena stood in the doorway, the golden light of sunset spilling through the dusty windows, painting long, soft shadows across the wooden floor. She turned slowly, taking in the quiet space, the echo of their footsteps, the smell of time and memory still resting in the walls. David walked up behind her, his hands gently resting on her shoulders. Together they looked out through the open door at the lake, now glowing orange beneath the fading sun. "It feels alive again," she said softly, her voice carrying both wonder and peace. David smiled, his voice low and warm. "It feels like it was waiting for you." She turned to him, her eyes glistening. "You really think I can make this place something special?" "I do," he said, "because everything you touch becomes something worth keeping." Lena's heart swelled with emotion. She leaned into him, resting her head against his chest, listening to the calm rhythm of his heartbeat, the sound steady and certain, like the promise of a new beginning. Outside, the wind stirred gently through the trees, the leaves whispering as if the land itself was breathing again after a long sleep. Lena stepped out onto the porch and looked toward the horizon, the last light of day fading into the calm surface of the lake. For the first time, she felt no doubt, no fear, no need to prove herself to anyone. The laughter from the dealership, the looks, the words, they no longer mattered. She had found something far greater than pride. She had found purpose. David came to stand beside her, their hands meeting naturally, fingers intertwining in quiet understanding. "This is home," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. David looked at her and nodded, his eyes soft with pride, "And love it always," was he said. As the last light of the sun disappeared behind the hills, the farmhouse stood bathed in the gentle glow of dusk, a promise of everything yet to come. And in that stillness between day and night, Lena smiled, knowing her story had truly begun.